Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri, and today we're going to talk about model governance. So this is an area that's not very exciting for most people, but it is absolutely critical when working with quant teams and doing risk management specifically. Any sort of firm should have these sort of practices in place, but today we're going to talk specifically about risk tiering and model definitions, which all falls under this idea of model governance. So the first question being, what is a model? Now, this seems pretty simple, but there are reasons why you need to define them. And as you start thinking about it more and more and going down the rabbit hole, and as you know, I've talked to a lot of different big banks as I've worked at big banks, the definitions often are not the same everywhere you go. Part of this has to do with resource control, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, how many resources you have. Part of it is trying to avoid extra work and regulation. So sometimes this is just lazy risk management practices and employees. But let's just try to define this as best as we can here. So I like to define models as the use of data to create predictions utilizing mathematical estimations here. So think about the fact that you have data coming in, that is quantitative. We're using that data to create some sort of little estimates here. So linear regression is the easiest thing to think about. You have an equation y equals alpha plus beta 1 x1, where all these x's are your variables. Those little betas, though, are the coefficients, and we're going to estimate some sort of math scalar here to actually predict y. Decision trees, for example, the exact same thing. You have to estimate exactly where you're going to do the splits. So what numerical values are going to be used to split on what variables? Again, these are all models. I would argue almost all types of machine learning, including unsupervised, is going to fall into the model space. Now, one of the largest global banks has done a little loophole, and they're trying to convince people that unsupervised does not count as models. I'm not going to go down that argument too much. But again, models take data, they create estimates in that modeling process here, and then those estimates are used and applied to new data to come up with actual predictions here. Now, there's something else called an EJM. That's what, many people in the industry call it, which are expert judgment models. A lot of times these are also called qualitative models, but an expert judgment model is the use of business expertise to create predictions utilizing mathematics here. So it sounds almost the same, but it's really not. I'll give you an example of this just to make it a little clearer here. Often we don't have data, the right data, so maybe we're using proxy data, or the data just doesn't exist. And so we might need to use expert experience and judgment to come up with some sort of model. One of the probably best examples of an expert judgment model is if you build credit scorecards and you're a big, massive bank, you have a lot of data. We build an actual model. But there are smaller banks that don't have a lot of data. They're not going to spend millions of dollars on data, and they're going to use their expert judgment from people that work internally to come up with a scorecard. So they might go through and say, based on my personal experience, the LTV, the amount financed, the interest rate, for example, and maybe a few other variables are all very predictive. And they use their experience and their expert judgment here to come up with scores for these. So if you have an LTV less than, 0.8, you get, 300 points. And if you have an LTV between 0.8 and 1.2, you end up with like 100 points. And you go down this and you get less and less. So they rank them based on risk. But again, it's all based on expert judgment. Now, there are also models that are going to be combinations of these, or part of this is going to be quantitatively driven, and other pieces or parts of this model is not going to be available with data, or there's some sort of struggle that they can't model it, or perhaps all the statistical modeling available in the team they have are unable to model something quantitatively. And so often you're going to have to make some sort of assumptions or expert judgment to kind of patch the gaps here. But expert judgment models are really somewhat like a model. Often they're rule-based decisioning, so you can think about that as well. Anything that's a rule-based decision is going to be an expert judgment model. It can be backed by data in the sense that we looked at the average score of this, or we looked at the min and max of this, or we looked at the variance of this data. And based on that, we think we want to break them out based on these, rules, these business rules or business logic here. So that's going to be considered an expert judgment model. Kind of like a model, but not really statistically driven or machine learning driven. And then finally, we have non-models. So non-models are going to be basically calculations. That's the easiest way to think about it. So anything you do in accounting in the sense of, assets equals liability plus shareholder equity, like these are just calculations. We just know this is the equation. We do the calculation. We get some sort of value here. Even something like calculating interest on a loan. Again, it's not a model, it's a calculation. Again, many business analysts, many business departments are going to be using Excel. Again, you can build models and EJMs in Excel, but a lot of what is all done in Excel is going to be just simple calculations. Another definition, which I didn't write on this slide here, is also the number of usages it gets. So often if it is a expert judgment model, maybe a model, but it's only done and calculated once. So it's very, very fast. You just need a number. People start to argue these are perhaps non-models because you're just trying to get a number or a value. And typically it's not a critical decision. So therefore it's kind of done on scratch paper, which Excel is kind of like scratch paper in the modern world here. And many firms kind of view those as non-models as well. So why do we care if it's defined as a model, an EJM, or a non-model? One's going to be resources. So if you have a quant team, quants are extremely expensive compared to other employees. And because of that fact, we don't want quants wasting time doing non-models. Also, you might end up saying EJMs. You might need to bring in an expert. You also want to assign it to a very specific team. Often here you might say, okay, this maybe needs to go into the operations team. They can build expert judgment models. And then you'd separate out and say, okay, statistical and mathematical models, we want the quant teams building this. So it kind of helps you align resources on, we need so many quants to do development and validation on the modeling side. We might need a quant to help with an EJM, but we're probably going to be bringing in more business experts or senior management for that. So we can kind of align the resources there. And then for non-model as well, it's just going to be a calculation. So we don't really care. These are often just kind of back of the envelope quick calculations here. This also helps keep risk all in control within a firm because, not surprising, many big banks find out they have all kinds of models that are being used and were created by all kinds of random departments, and there's no risk management around them. And so models are being used, decisions are being made, and nobody really understands what's going on from a firm-wide risk management perspective here. So creating processes and procedures and putting all this framework together and having definitions on what is a model, EJM, and non-model, and then allocating resources for these and going through a nice risk policy, a nice risk structure here for the firm, keeps us all in line so that we're moving together as one team towards one goal. And it reduces risk in the fact that we know what our risks are. We know where our models sit. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but you should have a model inventory where we're tracking all of these models, non-models, EJMs and whatnot, and trying to get some sort of system to get our head around what we are doing as a firm from a risk perspective here. And that leads us into risk tiering. So again, at risk inventory, you will tier out these models. So what is a risk tier? Well, risk tiers are going to be a system used to rank these models. Most firms use a 3-tier system where you have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Again, tier 1s are going to be the most critical models that the firm is going to use. Tier 3s are going to be the least critical. And again, some firms have different tierings here. So I'll make a little caveat, little note here just for insight. Some global firms will have tier 0, meaning this model is so critically important, it's actually used across the firm in multiple countries. So it is a tier 0. It is like if make or break the firm, and it'll impact the firm on a global level here. Other firms now are starting to add in what we call tier 4s. Tier 4s now are often just, they're throwing EJMs into tier 4s. So again, going back to the model definitions, models typically get tiered. Non-models don't get tiered. They're typically not worried about too much. EJMs now sit in that gray area, and many firms are creating tier 4s now to add these EJMs into these pieces. Again, it's a personal preference on how you manage and track your EJMs, but anything that is a model or an EJM should be tracked and monitored for risk, tolerances, for understanding the firm. And then when things start going south, when an economy crashes or a portfolio starts to fail, it's quite easy to kind of look into that model inventory and figure out which models are kind of driving these losses. So why do we actually care though? Like, why do we care that we are doing tiering and model definitions? This just sounds like a bunch of busy work. And most people I ask at most banks will tell you we do this purely because of regulatory purposes. This is 100% incorrect. Yes, you do it because you're being required to do it, but the real question is, why do regulators require it? And are you really managing your risks? I'm getting the feeling, though, when I talk to these people, they're not really in the business of managing risk. They're in the business of just pleasing regulators, which is one of the key issues here with the banking community as a whole. But the correct answer for why we actually care is it is a way to manage risk given limited resources here. So again, if we had all the resources in the world, money didn't matter, we would make every single model, every single non-model, every single EJM at tier 1. We would spend months and months validating and tearing apart every single little detail of every model, EJM, and calculation. And of course, we'd be so inefficient, we wouldn't be able to actually run a business. And also, we would never have enough money to hire enough people to look at every single thing in great enough detail and hire enough people to build all these ridiculous models. And we'd probably be overkilling everything with quants, which is not the goal. So again, we're going to look at risk and we're going to look at resources here. And we're going to talk a little bit about setting tiers. So let's talk about this resource constraint and risk management and how we set the tiers. And then we'll give an example here on how you would actually do this in practice. So when you go to set tiers, the one thing we're trying to figure out is how much impact do we have on the business? Okay. So this is challenging to do. There is no way to say it is going to have exactly this much. It is somewhat of a qualitative process, so somewhat like an EJM here. We need to look at the actual financial impact. So we can go back, look historically like it. For example, your loss models. So how much loss do we have coming out of a specific portfolio or out of a business that issues loans or out of a trading company? What is the value at risk on that kind of standpoint here. Trying to figure out, though, what are the losses, what are the financial impacts of a specific model, and also what are the potential risks of that model. So you might say we have a great model, it's in place. I don't know, we lose $100 million a month on this portfolio. But if that model failed, where would we be? So it's kind of a what if scenario. Like it might double. We might have double the losses. So this model might have 200 million losses here, but trying to look at this from an impact stance. So a lot of times people look at positions and portfolios. So they'll also rank these based off of how much just total dollars that model touches. So in the case of originations, pricing, even loss models, they might just consider the entire portfolio level. So we have a $60 billion portfolio, which we'll look at here in a second. And then figuring out, okay, this is critically important. This model, this pricing, this origination model here on a $60 billion portfolio is critical. Then you might say, well, we have some other sub portfolios, which might be a few $1 million. Again, it's still a pricing and origination model, but it's going to be on a really, really small portfolio. Again, the tiering in those cases would be less because there's less risk involved in this. And then, of course, we need to look also at resources. So we need to look at the number of employees we have, and we need to look at the experience of employees we have. Employees aren't just a calculation game here. You need to start considering efficiency of employees and also expertise. So yes, one quant who is an expert in one area is not duplicated by 10, generic run-of-the-mill quants. Having experience and expertise on a team gives you an edge in the sense that you can either, one, build better models than everybody else. This will reduce your model redevelopment cycle. And also, if you're validating, you will catch critical mistakes that will cost you more money down the run here. So again, you need to kind of look at this and figure out which employees you have, what resources you have available, how you can assign them. And then a tier should be set in conjunction with these resources as well as these potential risks, which we've kind of been looking at here. So let's just dive into an example to get a more clear idea of what's going on. The first step you do in this is going to be listing out all of your models you have. So if you don't have a model inventory, which you should have as part of model governance, you should list out every single model you have. And then the second piece of this is going to be estimating out the estimated financial impact here. Or you can do like the portfolio size, try to keep these things all in line. But for this example, I'm just pretending we have a pricing model which prices, let's say, loans on a $60 billion portfolio. We have an origination model, again, for that same portfolio. Those are probably going to be the critical, most important models we have. So I would list them at the top of the list. And then I have ... because we're going to have a lot of different models all falling through this kind of waterfall. An example of something that would probably be a tier 2 here would be like maybe a fraud detection model. Again, maybe this financial impact that we've estimated is around 600 million. So it's not as important as a $60 billion position, but 600 million is still a pretty good chunk and still going to be meaningful for the firm. And then at the very bottom, so I have a bunch of other models again. We might have something like a marketing model. And if this all goes awry and we can figure out how much volume marketing brings in, it might have about a $2 million impact here. Now, big global firms, $2 million is a drop in the bucket. It's still a model though, so it still needs to be tiered. We're going to put these in as the tier 3 models here. So step 1 is getting all the models listed, estimating out all the financial impacts here. Again, using some expert judgment, a little bit of data, a little bit of math, coming up with these financial impacts, or at least estimated ones. And then step 2 we're going to go into is figuring out how many months and how much time we need for development, and separately, how much time do we need for validation teams? And you could even go a step further and do implementation teams as well. But trying to figure out how much time we actually need for resources here. So this is all a resource calculation at this point. In this example, I'm just going to say tier 1 models are going to take about 6 months to develop and validate. Tier 2 models are going to take between 3 months for development and then 3 months for validation. Again, tier 3 is going to be 1 month for development, 1 month for validation here. So these are just numbers you can pull internally, looking at your teams, looking how efficient they are, kind of looking at some of these models you have in the inventory and giving an estimate on average how long it's going to take to do specific models. Again, consider interval of these redevelopment cycles as well. So I list out here too, this pretend bank has 80 models. It has a development team of 10. It has a validation team of 10. And I'm just going to focus on the development piece to make this simple. We're going to assume there are 2 developers per model. So you have a senior and a junior here. But also we need to think about, we have 80 models built. Let's pretend we add no new models. These models are going to have to be rebuilt over time as they need refreshes, as models somewhat fail. And again, we're going to have to revalidate all of these. And if you work in the banking industry or you work in any financial industry, you should have essentially redevelopment and revalidation periods where these models are checked and rebuilt, just to keep things kind of moving and operating as expected here. So again, looking at the timings here, looking at how many models you can build per team. In this example, each team's gonna have 2 devs on it. And then step 4 is going to be reviewing the combinations of models that you can have. So again, trying to figure out, okay, if we have 80 models, 10 developers and 10 validators here, and we know it takes 2 developers to build a model. And then we have our development cycles of 6 months per model, tier 1s, 3 months for tier 2s, 1 month for tier 3s. We need to go through and start building out a table here. Again, I hope my math is correct on this example. But you review the combinations here. So I just start off with, if everybody built a tier 1 model, how many could we build per year? Should be 10. Tier 2 should be 20, and tier 3 should be 60 in this example here. And then you'll want to fill in the middles of, adjusting how many models you think are probably going to come in from a planning perspective and a management perspective. But review these combinations and look at the team resources that you currently have. Step 5 is going to be considering any bottlenecks, validation, implementation issues here. So is your implementation going to be bottlenecking this process? Maybe your validation team is too small, which is often the case in many firms. And you have a ton of developers building models, but you can't get them validated in time, and so you can't get them into production. That's going to be an issue. So you need to start looking at the bottlenecks. You need to consider things like turnover as well. Maybe you have a lot of internal employee turnover. This costs time and money to get people up and going on your firm. So even if they're an expert in their field, it's often hard to adapt and readjust to new portfolios and positions and company policies and all that. So again, starting to take this into consideration as you're setting up your planning here. And then the next piece here is going to be risk. So we looked at the resources, we did a bunch of boring calculations, bunch of management here. And then this second slide here is going to be on the risk perspective here. I went through and said, okay, given a firm, given a hypothetical here, let's set our position at tier 1 is going to be anything greater than $1 billion in financial impact. Tier 2 is going to be between $500 million and $1 billion, and anything less than $500 million is going to be a tier 3. And based on that, given the resources we had from the previous slide, we can do 4 tier 1s, 6 tier 2s, and 18 tier 3s with what I have currently here. So the second step after this is going to be figuring out, okay, I sort all of my models. Anything greater than $1 billion is going to be tier 1. assign that, assign your tier 2s, assign your tier 3s. Look at the combinations you have and see, okay, which one is the closest to what we need for the next year, right? How many models need to be redeveloped? Looking at your OPM, ongoing performance monitoring, you can get an idea of what's going to have to occur next year. And then figuring out, okay, this is the closest combination we have. We can do, 4 models at tier 1, 6 at tier 2, 18 at tier 3. And now you need to go to step 2, which is going to be, from a risk perspective, are the crucial models being captured as tier 1? So, looking at those models, looking at the financial impacts, given these thresholds we assign, so in this example, greater than $1 billion, are we capturing all the critical models? Or maybe we're missing a few. If we're missing a few, we're going to have to readjust those tier bands to try to capture what we believe as a firm are the most critically important in your tier 1. So really focus on that band to start with. And then tier 2s and tier 3s, again, are important. You need to look at the financial impacts. I would be a little more lenient on these bands because they're tier 2s and tier 3s, which are important, but not critical often. And so trying to figure that out and trying to align these with the resources here. But you might come back to the question of, do you need more resources? So you might say, given our bands of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, maybe the numbers are just too high. We can't move the bands anymore because all the critical models in tier 1 is more than we have in employees and resources here. So we might need to hire more developers or more validators, looking at those bottlenecks again here. But doing this from a risk perspective of ensuring that when you look at that list and you read off that model name, in your mind, it really seems like a tier 1 or a tier 2 or a tier 3 here. So you need to use a little bit of experience here and expert judgment based on the tierings, based on crises, based on past data, but looking at it from a risk perspective. Another piece which I often see missed is, do you just need better training? So maybe you have enough employees, but maybe, as we saw in the previous slide, the amount of time it takes to develop a model just seems to be slow. And a good way to do this is reach out to your friends at other banks and see what timing they're doing. And you might realize your team's just under-trained. And so you might need to invest more time and resources in training. And then you don't have to hire a bunch of extra people, but then you can meet these goals for the next year or the year after, depending how you set up, your tiering and all your planning and your resources here. 2 other questions to look at are the standards for each tier too high or too low? So again, the frequency of the validation and developments here. Often we set frequency based on the tierings. So we will validate models sometimes once a year, once every 2 years. Some firms do quarterly or other frequencies if it's like a absolute critical model that's just driving the business. But again, if your frequency is too frequent, you're going to need too many validators. From a risk perspective, maybe it's too frequent, but you need to think about that from a risk perspective and a resource perspective as we're kind of thinking about this. Also from developments and redevelopments, are you redeveloping too soon? Like, is the model still working well enough? Or perhaps are your team, again, just not very good and you're building really crappy models and you're having to redevelop constantly here? So again, it's a resource quality issue that you might need to be thinking about as well, but aligning the tier standards on how you define the tiers, how you define redevelopments, for example, and ongoing performance monitoring is all going to impact the tiering and the resource planning. And finally, are you classifying models, EJMs, and non-models correctly? So there's going to be an incentive to classify more models as EJMs and kind of fudge those definitions, which is why I mentioned them at the beginning, because you want to make as many things as possible from a corporate standpoint, not a risk perspective, but a corporate financial standpoint. EJMs are non-models because you don't really have to validate them. You don't really care about them. And this is really a bad idea from a risk perspective because realistically, if they are actual models, you should be investing the time and resources to validate these models for risk. Development teams should be put in place with good quality developers so that you don't, make bad mistakes and lose money as a business here. So again, the classification process also needs to be reviewed in this, which is why I included those definitions. This includes how you set up the tiering, how you set up the frequency of validations and redevelopment cycles, also how you set up the thresholds for ongoing performance monitoring. So all of these things are kind of tying together from a risk perspective. And then finally, the third and final step of this process is you might have to reiterate this until reasonable tiers are set. So as I'm talking about this, you start to see that definitions play an important role. You start to see that quality of employees and training plays an important role. You start to see the number of resources, so number of employees you have on each individual team and managers and all that play a role. And so you might get to this step and say, I'm a little confused. And that's the point when I say, okay, go back to the previous slide here on the resource planning. Increase, for example, your development team by a couple employees, your validation team by a couple employees, rerun the numbers, go back through all that process and planning for financial budgeting. Then go into the second process, again, looking at the tiers, looking at the models. Does it make sense? Are the riskiest models in tier one? Are the models that are fairly important, have some risks that we really need to run the business but aren't critical? Are those in tier two? And then finally, are all the other models that we need but aren't, that big of a driver in the business? Are those all going to be in tier three? Go through this process again, ask yourself these questions again, try to solve these problems, and then go back to the step three again of thinking, okay, do I need to reiterate? Do I need to make some adjustments? Every time you make an adjustment, you should just really start the process over so you get a nice clean running calculation of how you're setting up these tiers and the resources available and making sure that you're managing all of the risk. And then as a final point for this whole entire process, tiers should be fairly stable, but don't forget to review them annually here. So part of your risk review process, which most firms have, you want to make sure that the tiers are meaningful to the firm. Maybe you've exited a bunch of positions, maybe you've sold a bunch of portfolios. You can actually reduce all of your thresholds for tiers because you don't have as much risk, you don't have as much exposure. Maybe you bought another firm and your risks have increased, you would need to adjust that as well. It's just good practice to review these every year. Again, it's kind of an annual end of the year budgeting, resource planning as well. You can kind of look at these two perspectives here and figure out, maybe we should adjust them up or down a little bit. But I will emphasize here, your tiers should not move just because of resources alone. So often firms are trying to minimize resources, and firms get very tempted to move the definition of tiers to reduce the number of employees they need, the number of regulation they have. So don't be tempted to throw risk out the window just to save a little bit of money here. And I'll make a final interesting note here as well. One of the firms I was at, their regulators, which were the Federal Reserves, actually came back to them and said, your tiers are actually too wide. So you have too many tier ones, which is the big critique here. So they actually recommended we shrink that. So, it's not like firms are just trying to optimize cost. We're also managing risk, but you need to balance the two pieces here. Be a little bit realistic. You shouldn't have massive development teams and validation teams just for the sake of risk management. It should add value to the bottom line as well. So anyways, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And as always, until next time.